actually have, so I've worked as a climate change planner and also as a storyteller. And my work in both of these areas has made me realize that they're very like intertwined processes. So this worksheet just focuses on some of the questions that I ask myself as a storyteller and also as a planner. And then there's a couple of like quick examples just to help you get a feel for what I'm saying. And I'm going to try to remember here at the end to focus on the questions that we maybe haven't hit on so hard yet. And I'm going to go into the breakout rooms as well, and we can certainly talk about you know, any of the questions, but I'll probably try and focus on the ones that I think we've spent a little bit less time on so far. So blah blah blah. Next slide, please. Actually, I already said all this stuff. So next slide. What I've done is I've set it up as, you know, 3 separate areas: problem, process, and solution, and then a couple of sub questions under each of these. So, you know, at its heart, climate change planning is really all about storytelling, whether a planner is solving for storm floods or wildfires or drought or sea level rise or whatever the issue is. There is an embedded narrative that I, you know, put out here of problem, process, and solution. And I really liked what Jillian said this morning also about enemies, which is something that's not explicit in this presentation, but I do often think about, you know, within climate change planning, within any urban planning context, there is usually a hero and a villain as well. That's just good storytelling for you. And I think that like the way that it's often set up is that the problem in this context is usually whatever the climate impact is. So hopefully getting down to that level of specificity, not just climate change, but if you're dealing with, you know, wildfire or flood. The process, the public process, is mandated in the US, and it is usually trying to, you know, engage a group of people who are living together in that specific location. And the solution is always something vague about increasing the resilience and adaptive capacity of this group of humans in the face of whatever that climate disaster is that they're facing. So that's really the setup. And now we can go to, yes, the sort of problem space is, I think in my observation, it's historically focused on the needs of one population. I think we've all seen how these processes happen. It's often like homeowners or whoever the loudest and most well-organized constituents are. And this is the bane of all urban planners, really, is when you have one very strong, well-organized group who drowns out public voices and really kind of stymies real progress. Planning also historically often discounts the value of healthy processes and natural worlds that we depend on, like oceans for food and for the air we breathe. And it's also usually bounded by science. It's, you know, planning is technocratic, it's bureaucratic, so it's also very litigious in the US. And so there's usually a lot of emphasis on science. And then, so how we define that problem, this is often, like I said, in the context of science. There's often a dominant narrative, and my quick example will go through this one. In planning, again, the supporting information is usually in the form of best available science. This is a super hot contested issue right now, just because a lot of climate science moves really fast. And it's also necessary to leave out conflicting information or information that would overwhelm the people who are involved in the process. So Shrishti, can you tell me what my next slide is, or show me, let's move to the next slide so I can remember which of the examples I wanted to bring here. Oh, yes. Okay. So this is actually an example from a book I wrote called The Atlas of Disappearing Places. This picture is just a a picture. My collaborator made this image that you see on seaweed, actually. So it's like drawing all of this scientific information on seaweed, and the red shows where danger areas are. This is New York. So with this book, there's 20 chapters, and each chapter talks about one like climate impact. So increased precipitation, for example, or if you have a storm surge on top of a hurricane, like what's happening with Ian right now in Florida. So obviously, if you think about like actual climate science, there is usually not just one impact at a time, and it doesn't impact just one place. So I went through an intentional process of simplifying the science for the sake of the story. And it was excruciating, because I spent a lot of time working for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where, you know, science is everything, and you really, your goal is essentially to put other people to sleep with your ability to name facts and data. So I think that we all do this in storytelling and in planning. And the planning field is often not open enough, I think, about which facts they've chosen and why. And I think that being able to disclose how you are shaping that story is really important to provide transparency and authenticity to your viewers. And also, frankly, as fire, as like, you know, cover fire, when you're in the middle of a public process and you have a well-organized group of people who want to challenge, you know, what it is you're saying or the legitimacy of the information that you bring to the table. Next slide. Oh, process. Yeah, so I mentioned this a little bit in planning. It's a very historically like technocratic and bureaucratic process. I say this with all the love as a, you know, trained planner, that there's a lot of limitations with it, which have led to a lot of really horrible local land use outcomes. And I think that this also relates to how we develop and shape stories. With climate change, uncertainty is an enormous one. It's linked again to the science, right? We don't know what we don't know. And so it's really important to think through how your process is going to handle uncertainty, either the scientific uncertainty or the social uncertainty of what you're proposing, what your outcomes are going to be. And we also all insert our own bias into these processes. May not think about who is impacted by that bias. And finally, planning often results in zero-sum games. I'm thinking about like water rights is obvious, is normally put as a zero-sum game. Someone wins and someone loses. Someone has water and someone has none. And as storytellers, thinking through how we manage these three big areas, and again, disclose where we've landed and what decisions we're making intentionally as keepers of a narrative is key. Let's go to the next slide here. Oh my gosh, so this is, I was a part of Marin County's sea level rise planning process. So Marin County in San Francisco, it's just north of San Francisco. It's a very wealthy community, is how most people think of it. And this process that we were doing to figure out how to approach sea level rise in Marin County wound up, the meetings were held at like 3 p.m. on Tuesdays, and they were held in a big, beautiful historical barn that you couldn't get to unless you had a car. And this is who we wound up with. I was there with a colleague of mine who observed to me, wow, there's a lot of bald white heads in this room. So I decided to take that picture because it was so like emblematic of the problem, right? There is an expert scientist who is talking to a bunch of people who feel that they have they're entitled to be in this government space talking about this problem, which is what to do about sea level rise. Right after I took this picture, I realized that, you know, we had defined the problem as basically homeowners and property values. And I wanted to figure out a process that would like open up this problem space. So we started working with high school students to actually ask them, have them lead a community process about what people were worried about in the community. And it turns out that lots and lots of people are not rich in Marin and don't have property to worry about. What they have to worry about is their renters in low-income neighborhoods, and their landlords are not paying for mold remediation, right? So they have physical problems related to issues already, not a distant world in the future where they might lose the value of their home. Right now, they're having public health impacts. And they also are often newcomer communities, and they do not feel like they belong in a room full of bald white heads. So their voices are not heard through this process. Next slide. Which, you know, obviously then gets into what kind of solutions are being proposed. In planning, the word solution and the word vision are often, in my mind, conflated. Everyone wants to have like an equitable, resilient community, but I balk at the lack of metrics around that, which I know sounds very sort of like corporate of me, and it is, but I also think about how we all get funding for the kind of work that we want to do longer term. And that funding often requires things like having a really solid set of metrics. But I'll back up a second. So, you know, values are what I often think about, like, what are the implicit or explicit ideas that we have about the world, or things that we want to see, which are reinforced through the solutions that we bring forward. So, you know, again, back to Marin County really quickly, do we value property or do we value public health, right? Those are implicit ideas that were about to be jammed into our process, which we were finally able to get out of there. I've actually worked with a lot of conservative Christian and Catholics on environmental issues. And for me, it's been really eye-opening to, as a secular person, to think about the different baselines to which we both approach a process. And so being in the same room with folks who have really differently held beliefs from me has helped me be a little bit more, you know, respectful and understanding, ask more than you speak, that sort of narrative, that sort of work. And I always think about how to do that as a storyteller. You know, what are the values that I am forcing upon my participants or my readers? I think that goals are, this is going to actually switch to a very different set of topics. So in government agencies, there's often logic models, and I will find some logic models and drop this in for folks. But a logic model just sort of maps out what resources you have, what are your short, medium, and long-term goals, and how do you get to those goals. And so if any of you have ever looked for government, either federal or state funding in the US, there's often this way of mapping what you're trying to do to these short, medium, and long-term goals. And then right on the heels of that comes the metrics. So what is it what data are you going to be using to actually measure progress against your short, medium, and long-term goals? And so short-term goals, in planning, it's often like the number of people that attend an event, or the number of affordable houses that were created, or dollar amounts that have been saved from sea level rise. In terms of how we think about that for the kind of projects that you're working on, it's probably things like number of visitors or number of views. And I think that those metrics are really good. Like I said, they're often really great for funders to see those short-term metrics. We reached X number of people, but it's usually not a good way to figure out whether or not you're getting to your medium or your long-term goals, right? Your medium-term goal, if your short-term goal is the number of people you reach, your medium is usually something around behavior change. So number of people whose behavior you're changing, number of people who vote on a measure locally, or who, approve that housing. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn from game engine monetization here, and the way that games examine what it is their participants are doing in game. And again, I'll just make a note to myself to put some resources into our collective wisdom area around this. And then, long term is the holy grail. That's actually what we're all trying to do, right? That's the systemic change that guides our vision of what we want to create, and that guides a lot of our work. And that is absolutely the hardest to track or measure. I don't think that we have very good attribution for that. And this is actually an area of my own research interest. So if anyone wants to nerd out with me about that, please do. I may have put in one more slide here. Can you see, Shristi?
Do you see that?
Yeah, yes. So this is actually, this is a very cool project called Critical Distance, and it's by Adam May. He made this in Unity, and it's an AR experience where you swim with this pod of endangered orcas. And he's put it in a lot of different areas, and in a lot of different like science museums. And it's been super hard to measure the impact of even like number of people. So some museums have little clickers where they can like take count of the number of people that you actually meet. And then we're starting to really think through offboarding. So like once someone gets out of that headset, what is the first thing you want them to do or see? Is there a way that you can take the emotional experience they just had, assuming they had an experience, as we've been looking at and talking about this past week? How do you channel that energy into the kind of next step behavior that you want? So I think I've probably talked for too long. That is the end of this. And those are just really, I think I can probably put myself back on here. So those are the areas that I think about. I think we haven't, in my experience, and I'm totally biased because I come from science land, I think that I would love to hear more about science that folks are using and the facts that you are and are not. And I'm really interested in thinking about how you're all going to be measuring impact.